Okay, so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Erik Lindahl, who has essentially a dual appointment as the KTH Royal Institute of Technology and University of Stockholm in Sweden. Erik is very well known for his contribution in computational science and HPC in molecular simulations. He has essentially developed the package GROMOX, which is called the Gromming Machine for Chemical Simulations. And he essentially will talk about how to map GROMOX to GPUs and talk about his experience essentially on using large-scale machines for molecular simulations.
So. Thank you, Olaf. It's great to be here, and it's so fun. Everything is always so impeccably organized here, and in particular with the European Union elections now, I guess we shouldn't go into national stereotypes, but last time, so you're now worried that we were 9 minutes late at the end of the second day. Last time I gave a talk in Barcelona, we were an hour and a half late after the first talk. Not mine, though. I'll try to do my best. So. It's always difficult to give a talk to a diverse audience and everything, so I'm not going to talk so much about our life science applications. I have 2 or 3 slides on that. But then I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about our general challenges. GROMACS was actually a hardware machine from that. There's a reason why it's called machine. My big love in life is molecular simulation and understanding chemistry, really. And this spans over an insane number of orders of magnitude, both in space and time. Being in Switzerland, you have all this amazing materials chemistry here, which frequently occurs down on these scales of femto to attoseconds or something. Somewhere here, nano microseconds, this is where I live. Chemistry, lots of fun things happen here, proteins fold and everything. And eventually you would like to go all the way up to some sort of biology that's happening on seconds. There are huge computational challenges here, spanning everything from multi-scale modeling, trying to improve acceleration, parallelization of programs, so this is pretty much my life. We're pretty happy that we are somewhere here in the middle. We just need to go up to a millisecond or something, and I think we have fairly good ideas how we should get there. And sometime in the future, I guess we would like to be on a second. Not sure whether that's going to happen before my retirement. Molecular simulation is really boringly simple in a way. Forget about quantum chemistry and everything. I just obey old Uncle Newton, and I have a surprisingly simple, this is actually very simple. I just calculate small springs and everything, electrostatic interactions. I say that atoms can't bump into each other, and then I try to integrate this as a function of time. The big problem here is that as a function of time requires me to use a time step in the ballpark of femtoseconds. And there are lots of femtoseconds to a millisecond. So you usually sped up, and every time you do that, you have to redo everything, interactions between every single atom in the system. The other horrible thing with this is that you can't use anything like pre-optimized matrix libraries or anything. You have to code the entire interaction ourselves, which is really a curse. It's fun, but it's a curse. However, what that enables us to do, and the reason why we persist in doing this, is that there is so many amazing things we could do in computational chemistry. Already today, we are in the ballpark of a microsecond a day or so. There is no limit to the amount of motions we can understand. I can really simulate how an ion channel opens. If you had a glass of wine yesterday at the buffet, that wine bound to ion channels in your nerve system, we can actually simulate exactly how that alcohol binds, exactly why that stimulates some nerve signals and why it prevents others, which we're using to design better anesthetics, for instance. Now, if you bring that up an order of magnitude or something, there are really cool things we could do to really start designing how proteins move when you add a new drug or something. And if you just keep going up somewhere around 100 microseconds or even a millisecond a day, then we would really be replacing current wet lab experiments with simulations that we do in the computers instead. Now, on the one hand, looking back, it's very easy to feel confident that the entire field has made so many progress over the last 2 decades or so. The sad thing is that we have made progress in the sense that we moved up from using these really old, small, embarrassing clusters to some of the largest machines in the world. But what we have predominantly been doing is that we're running larger and larger and larger and larger systems. We might have improved the absolute performance at the timescales by, say, 1 or maybe 2 orders of magnitude if we're really lucky. But in principle, we're still stuck in this situation where larger systems mean I can simulate an even larger system, hundreds of millions of particles. But that's not really very interesting to most things I want to do in biochemistry. If I want to understand an ion channel like the small guy there, I can probably do that within the ballpark of, say, 150,000 atoms or something. And the fact that Pitt Steins might be able to simulate 150 million or billion or trillion particle system, yeah, that might get me very good scaling, but it's not really going to solve the scientific question I had. And I think that's a traditional embarrassment in this field. And I'm as guilty as everybody when we show these scaling benchmarks of our codes. It scales really well for problems that are completely irrelevant. The relevant problems, they don't scale. And then on the other hand, the only problem, you can't really complain either, because we're even developing this code ourselves since almost 20 years. This might, well, at some point in time I wrote this as a good slide. The bad thing here is that this line, 2 million lines of code, including a shitload of assembly. Trust me, you don't want to hack this. And this is still a fairly decent code compared to many of the ones that are standard Fortran, meaning they don't even have the features of Fortran 77. And they're surprisingly common if you look at the supercomputers. And I think I have the great illustration for Bill's talk that, so when it comes to scaling, for a very long time, GROMACS did not scale very well. And very well is the understatement of the year. We scaled horribly bad. This is a system that I actually had in my PhD thesis. It's cholesterol. Sorry, if I can squeeze that in, you're going to get the better colors. This never scaled very well. I could use 20 processors in Stockholm or something, which was like a fourth of the supercomputer at the time. And then at the time, Blue Gene announced their new Blue Matter code for Blue Gene. It's an absolutely amazing code. They scaled to 3 atoms per processor, and for this 8,000 processor system they ran the benchmark, they could run 10 nanoseconds a day for this system. And at the time of my, well, a couple of years after my PhD thesis, this was simply awesome. I couldn't get anywhere close to that. Like, the absolute best thing I could do in GROMACS was like 2 nanoseconds per day on my desktop. And I haven't bought a Blue Gene lately, but something tells me it's a little bit more costly than 5 desktops. And this is, of course, the problem. Their code scaled amazingly well because they hadn't even bothered to care about performance. And our code was absolutely horrible scaling, and I'm not going to try to defend it another way because I only cared about performance. And that's a problem here, because you can't start with the scaling. Then your performance is going to suck. On the other hand, you can't start just with your performance either, because you're going to design all these stupid 2 million lines of assembly code that are going to be a nightmare to try to parallelize. So the problem is that you really need to do both things at the same time. So one might figure at this point, we had a winning strategy here. We had awesome performance. Nobody could touch us when it comes for bang for the buck and everything. But the problem is this classical thing, I need to achieve a longer simulation. And well, 20 years ago, you could just sit back and enjoy the ride that CPUs increased 50% in frequency every year. That's not happening anymore. We're buying a new computer in Stockholm, and again, it's going to be slower, lower frequency than the last one. So that if you do that, you're going to get lower performance for every new generation of your computer, and that's not a winning strategy. And my problem really, if I take time steps in the ballpark of a couple of femtoseconds, I need 200 million iterations just to reach 1 microsecond of simulation time. And to do that in a day, which is like the bare minimum, each iteration must complete in a couple of hundreds of microseconds of wall clock time, so far under a millisecond. Now, that is not completely hopeless. If you look at, this is the advantage of a simple code. This is just our loop. We do some calculated how atoms are bonded to each other, and then I calculate interactions between all atoms that are close in space, and then I do a bit of lattice summation, and then I update my positions. And then I just repeat this over and over and over again. And say every 10 to 50 steps, I need to update the list of what atoms are in proximity of myself. And then integrate these equations of motions, and that's pretty much it. The problem here has to do with the non-bonded interactions. These interactions that every little atom here has a list of the red and yellow atoms here that are within, say, a 10 angstrom or something of myself. And those are the ones whose positions I need to calculate at every step and calculate how far they are away from me. The problem here is that it's horrible in the sense that these atoms move. And I constantly need to update all these data structures. I have very much random accesses in memory, and I really need to rely on dynamic load balancing. So even when we had a couple of years ago, even with amazing network performance, the type of network performance that Bill doesn't want me to ask for, I maxed out somewhere around 250 atoms per core, meaning I could not have fewer atoms per core than I didn't scale. And I might be able to get 100 atoms per core. I'm going to show you that today. Maybe 10. There is no FS checking way that I'm going to reach 1 atom per core. So the problem is that if I want to get those 3, 4, 5 orders of magnitude speed up, I need faster nodes, not just more nodes at lower clock. And that's kind of the curse of my algorithm. And the problem there is that we're kind of screwed when it comes to CPUs. The one thing that we know currently in CPUs, they're not getting appreciably faster every year. So very early on, we decided that we need to look into alternative architectures. And at the time, I was a postdoc at Stanford, and we decided to go for GPU acceleration. Now, GPU acceleration, to most of you think of these new fancy Tesla cards. When we started doing GPU acceleration, we were doing the GeForce 4 card. So this card actually doesn't even have 32-bit floating point. You had to get by with 16-bit floating point operations. No program could be longer than, I think it was 4,000 bytes or 4,000 instructions. So like, just forget about it. It's absolutely nightmare card, and we didn't really get anywhere. But the problem is that CPUs are dying too. CPUs are getting ever more complex. That floating, my type of code, they're easy. They're simple-minded in a way. I care about floating point performance, forget about everything else. The only problem is that Intel and AMD don't really care about floating point performance. The floating point unit could be something like roughly that area, and there are 4 of them per chip. So it's probably 1 or 2% of the chip die area that are floating point units. Everything else is stupid cache, branch prediction, shit, and the things that I'm completely uninterested in. And say what you want about those GPUs, but they're a floating point monster. It basically consists entirely of floating point units. And that's kind of too good not to use. I need to be able to use that one way or another. But we're coming back to this thing that it's much easier to port and scale a simple program, and we see greater reference scaling if we had not introduced any optimization. Our problem is that we started off from a program that was very heavily optimized. We were trying to use every single trick in the toolbox. And then you see this code and try to port it to a GPU. Like you're using ideas about specific timing of instructions on Intel. We used tons of SIMD code, which is great on the CPU. But the entire code base has really been optimized to achieve great performance on a given architecture, CPUs. And like you just get headaches if you even want to think about trying to port that to a GPU. And then you get even more irritated because we spent like 2 years on this, and the first GPU tries we did, they were 100 times slower than running on a CPU. And you know what's even more irritating than that? Sorry. The reason for that is that this is a really difficult structure to port to the GPU, right? We basically have a list that's dynamically allocated in memory that keeps indices where we do random access in memory and find what neighbors are close in space. And that like a GPU faints if it only sees that data structure. It's like the anti-Christ for a GPU. You can't even think of that. But you know what's even more irritating? Then you see these other competitors or a new student developing a GPU code, and they claim that they got a factor 20 speed up. And that, of course, has to do, they started from a code. Well, what people do is that they spend 3.5 minutes writing a simple reference code on the CPU. Then they spend 18 months optimizing the shit out of a GPU code, and the GPU code is faster. It is. The only problem is that their GPU code was still slower than our CPU code, but you can't argue about that. That's not how it works in the world. So on the one hand, we're back in this thing that we're doing fairly well. I'm not going to show these benchmarks, but we did well on the CPUs and everything. And there's this nagging feeling, Jesus, they're all these young guys and they're doing GPUs. And on the one hand, you think that they're just cheating. They don't really have good performance. On the other hand, I know that it's a floating point monster. We would like to use that floating point monster too. And that's where we are in this, the thing that I had alluded to in the title, the Inventors Dilemma. So the problem, it's a classical question in business. The problem is that if you're somehow leading, and I'm not arguing that we're leading the market here, but if you're somehow leading the market, the last thing in the world you want to do is introduce some sort of new disruptive technology that kills the market. Because the first one you're killing is yourself, right? And that means that you become conservative. And that's true in science too. We and everybody else, you become conservative because you're really good at what you're doing. But sooner or later, there is a youngster that overtakes you, because they don't have that 20 years of horrible 2 million lines of assembly CPU code to drag along. And eventually, that's what started happening here. And it's not so much that we get worried, but I get more irritated on our own that, Jesus, we used the one thing that nobody could ever touch us on is performance. And suddenly, you are these people that are doing just as well as we did, because they're using GPUs. So I'm going to talk about our second generation GPU approach here. The reason for the first one is that it pretty much we never ever got better than an order of magnitude slower than the CPUs. And the reason for that, because we had this really bright idea that the GPUs is really complicated, it's really different from a CPU, so that to make the best possible use of this, we're going to treat it as a black box, and we're going to run the entire simulation, have a small core loop on the GPU. I have a bunch of slides somewhere on my laptop where I can make a really good argument for this. It sounded really good 5 years ago. The problem with this is that we ended up getting reasonably good performance, but then you start realizing that among those 2 million lines of code, there is a very large toolbook full of tricks. Now, tricks is a dangerous word in science nowadays, but many of those tricks are very valid. They're good scientific approximations that helped us squeeze out about an order of magnitude more performance than just a brute force simulation. And we couldn't use any of those in the GPU because there were like 1 million lines of code that we would need to port to CUDA. And then you start to get a headache again. It's like, Jesus, every single algorithm that any student ever writes in my lab, now we would need to port that to CUDA. And then we can even then we can only run on a fraction of all the accelerators out there. At the time, the AMD was very important too. And the other problem is that you can't really parallelize either. Then we need to run the entire parallelization on the CPU, on the GPU. And the parallelization is frequently lots of bookkeeping, keeping track of all these halo zones and everything. And that's really something and a GPU, which is a streaming processor, is not very well adapted to. And it's kind of stupid to try to run these random access algorithms in the GPU where we have a 100 gigaflop CPU monster sitting right next to us, and we're letting we're letting both of them idle because we're running entirely on the GPU. So we decided in the second approach that if we really need to beat ourselves, we're going to need to use both the CPUs and the GPU at the same time. That is not as simple a solution as it sounds, because between these two, there is a horrible thing called the PCI Express bus, which is a bottleneck, very big bottleneck. Oh, small bottleneck, that's even worse. Bad bandwidth, bad latency. That's the whole reason we tried to avoid it in the first place. But of course, let's assume that we can't avoid it. The neat thing here is that what we have in there on the left is really these processors. We have like 16 cores here. They just love random memory access. They love interpolating things on grids that the GPU hates. While the GPU is really a floating point throughput monster where the CPU can't touch it. So let's try to use the best of both worlds. So we rapidly decided on an algorithm where, I'm getting a bit complex here, but each of these squares is a node. So in each node, you typically have 2 CPUs, 2 CPU dies with 6 to 12 cores each, and then a GPU connected to each PCI Express bus. So I run 1 GPU job really per CPU socket, because they're connected very close to each other. And then I use a number 6 to 12 OpenMP threads, just as Bill mentioned here. And the reason for that is that programming raw threads is a nightmare. It's even worse than programming CUDA. And at some point, I think I gave this presentation at NVIDIA and said, oh, yeah, so you went for the simple setup. So this is a simple setup. I don't want to see the complicated GPU parallelization setup. Because suddenly we're doing parallelization all these different levels. We have explicit MPI parallelization here. We have OpenMP parallelization here. We have SIMD parallelization for parts of the code. We're offloading parts of it to GPU. We're pretty much trying to use every trick in the cookbook. Now, the cool thing with that is that rather than having that simple loop, as I showed you before, we're running most of the job here on the CPU, but the really big, expensive part, the one that accounts for 90+% of the runtime, the non-bonded faucet, that one we farm out to the GPU. And I'm not sure if this is a performance model, Bill, but we kind of started in a very naive way. I don't know anything about that fancy stuff. I'm not a computer scientist. So I ended up with, we started our code by we didn't have any GPU code, so I started by just commenting out this code. I think, how fast, assuming that I didn't have to do this on the CPU, and assuming that the GPU was infinitely faster, which is not, how far would we scale and what performance could we get? That we can never, ever get better than that. And that way, yeah, we would get like a factor 5 speed up, and we would scale like there's no tomorrow, and that's pretty good. So we decided to do that, not necessarily because it's the best ultimate approach, but it's something that's feasible. And the other nice thing for us is that now we would only need a couple of 100 lines of GPU code here. The really big problem here is that I'm going to be super sensitive to latencies. I can't afford to lose a cycle across the PCI Express bus. I need to send over the streams here everything here needs to be asynchronous. So I can set off the streams, the GPU does its business here, and then sends it back to the CPU instantly, so I can integrate while the CPU then takes care of all the communication and fancy stuff. But the nice thing is that I won't even have to touch any of the domain decomposition. Everything we spent 20 years working on, I can reuse instantly. And that's worth a lot to me. And then the problem starts hitting you. So I hate GPUs and I love GPUs. The cool thing with them is that it really forces to reconsider some of the very basics of what computing is. So in molecular simulation, you remember that I told you this about the non-bonded interactions a bunch of times? That is kind of the basic thing of simulation. This is called the Verlet linked list, and it's a publication from like 1967. You can't use that anymore. Like, I won't even try to convince you the headache when you read, we can't use this. Like, it's the only algorithm in the field that's 40 years old. We can't use it. Like, we spent these years trying to tweaking 1 or 2 units of % of better performance out of code, something, and suddenly you're going to need to abandon. Like, had you asked me 5 years ago if we're ever going to abandon the link cell data structure in the code, I would say no, never. That's the one constant in the code. And we're forced to abandon that one. And the problem here is that sending over all this information every step, it's simply an order of magnitude too much data to send over the PCI Express bus. It will never work on the GPUs. We're not the only ones who've tried this. So there is a traditional solution here that you kind of group interactions into tiles, and it's actually surprisingly easy. So if this is my system that I show in 2 dimensions here, but it's really 3-dimensional, if I now group the entire system into some sort of spherical, sort of voxels here, if the blue atom here should interact with all the red atoms within a cutoff, if I now say that that means that the central tile there, the green tile there, should interact with all the tiles that are within range, suddenly I'm saying that the green tile here has to interact with all the pink tiles here. And the problem is there's a whole lot more interactions here than it is on the left. Now, the good news is that it's very easy for me to introduce a cutoff check here, so I can tell the GPU to set these interactions to 0. The other good news is once you do this and publishing it, what everybody does is you publish your flop rates, because you get amazing flop rates. And the reason why you get amazing flop rates is you're calculating roughly a factor of 3 too much stuff. But that's really good for improving your flop rate. So the way I like to compare this is to the art of calculating zeros. This is the GPU flop rate. Of that, the red part is the useful one. So you're spending like 75 to 80% calculating zeros. The result 0.0. And that's why I hate anybody, and it's not just limited to GPUs, that's why I hate the whole idea of comparing flop rates. If you have a stupid algorithm that uses too many operations, you're going to get a great flop rate. And everything we've done in GrowMax the last 10 years has reduced our flop rate, but improved our performance. And that's not bad, that's good. So what we need to do then is come up with a new way to find neighbors in space. So assuming that you have a bunch of molecules, it doesn't really matter what they are. We first do a very, very simple gridding. Traditionally, you would do this gridding in X, Y, Z, and then try to find the neighbors by checking what the grid elements are in range. But we do this slightly differently. So we do gridding in the first 2 dimensions, X, Y, and then we sort the particle in the 3rd dimension. So that I end up with a bunch of these small, it's not really, well, it is voxels, but they're uneven. And each element here is not, each tile here contains exactly 4 or 8 or 16 particles. So they're evenly divided in the number of particles rather than the volume of space. And then I use this to build a cluster pair list. So I really have a pair list that's not really a pair list, but it's a proximity list of these, well, it's not really tetrahedra, but you can think of them as tetrahedra. So these 4 particle group here are in range of what other 4 particle groups. The neat thing is that this reduces the amount of memory we need to store these lists by a factor of 16, even more. It's 64 if you do it higher. And this, once you have things organized in this tile, the GPU just loves you because you have 4x4 interactions here, and these are so easy to stream through. It actually turns out that these are surprisingly efficient. They're not quite as efficient as the theoretical maximum, but pretty darn close. And once we were there, we started to be pretty happy if you look at raw execution times. This is a bit of a complicated plot. I'm going to need to take you through it. So again, I'm not really interested in these fanciness of showing the largest possible system, but I'm interested in the smallest possible system. Because that's really, if I can scale down to, say, 1,000 atoms per GPU, if I have a system with 100,000 atoms, I can scale to 100 GPUs, and that's good. So what this one tries to show is that performance as a function of the number of atoms, but where I normalize the performance per 1,000 atoms. So that in a perfectly ideal world, this should be constant, but the reason why it goes up here is that when I have very small systems, say 1,500 atoms on a GPU, I simply start losing performance because I can't keep them busy. The cool thing here is if you look at the execution times here, I'm well below 100 microseconds of absolute time, even for the smallest system. And if I could reach the theoretical peak here, I will be like 30 microseconds or something. So I would be doing close to 10 microseconds a day. The problem is that CUDA is not really meant for this. GPUs are not meant for this. If you look at, you start calculating here, we're taking like 5,000 frames per second. And that's like 2 orders of magnitude more than a hardcore gamer. Well, no, a hardcore gamer would probably want 100 frames per second. But again, we're doing 5,000 frames per second, and pretty much every single thing in the CUDA libraries and everything is overhead. The smallest possible imbalance between different parts of the GPU, overhead that creates imbalance. So first I have problems with my kernel scaling, and then I have problems with actually executing things in the CUDA library and everything. So the smallest system, sure, they perform much, much, much better than the CPUs, but I can't get anywhere near to using the full potential of the hardware. And then Szilard in my group spent a good part of a year just sitting and tweaking kernels, optimizing things with SM processors and everything. This is the other sad thing. I used to be the best person at this in the group. I can't even understand his code anymore, which I guess is part of the scientific nature, right? But it's a bit irritating where I have absolutely nothing to say when it comes to performance monitoring in the group anymore. Doing this, we are, at least for large system, we would approach roughly 30 microseconds execution time if we could do that for the smallest possible systems, but we can't yet. But we are roughly an order of magnitude faster than would be to calculate these interactions on the CPU. There are some things remaining here. I'm not going to spend any time on it here, but basically we're complaining heavily to NVIDIA that there is too much overhead in these libraries. You should be so glad that you're not NVIDIA, Bill. There are, again, these libraries are made for gaming. So suddenly they lose 10 milliseconds here and there. They don't think it's too much of a deal, and we just cry. And the problem is that every small arrow here, green, pink, and everything, introduces overhead when we're starting new kernels and sending things between the CPU and the GPU. I'm not going to bother you with that, because I'm rather going to start painting the positive picture instead. We do fairly well in performance, and by fairly, I mean really. So these are, just to compare it, just think, Amber is our favorite competitor. We love each other, and that's why I always use them. Amber is one of the major dominant codes in the field. They're running a small system that's roughly 24,000 atoms, using a CPU, and I think there's a bunch of them, like 6 or so, 96 cores in total. They get in the ballpark of 40 nanoseconds per day. People will have killed for that 20 years ago. And again, the reason why we never really been bothered about this is GROMACS using 6 cores, we could beat that on my desktop. But then these nasty guys did the GPU port, and on their desktop, they suddenly beat us. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why we suddenly get very interested in GPUs, too. The problem with GPUs, and this is not limited to Amber, is that the scaling sucks. So if you go from 1 GPU to 4, you're getting like 30% or something, not too good. But the neat thing with the new code we have, we're using both the CPUs and the GPUs, we get awesome performance. If I add one simple GPU here, I roughly double the performance. And the cool thing is that I can keep reusing all these tricks that we have had in the code for a number of years, long time steps, turning some particles into virtual sites so that I don't integrate the fastest degrees of freedom and everything. And the performances we get here now are close to 400 nanoseconds per day, just using a desktop. So this is not even running in parallel yet. There's another fancy example, the villain headpiece. This is a famous protein because it was the first protein that people, well, they didn't quite fold it, but Peter Coleman almost folded it in 1998, using like 6 months of computing time on hundreds of processors on the largest supercomputers in the US. And he managed to get almost a microsecond of simulation time. Beautiful science paper at the time. That takes us roughly 22 hours on a desktop nowadays. I think that tells us something about this field has developed. It was 16 years ago since this was the state of the art, using all the resources Peter could get access to in the US. And now we're doing it in 22 hours. I like to compare this to Battlefield. Frames per second is a much cooler than nanoseconds per day. Now, we would not be here if we didn't talk about parallelism. And we scale. We scale very well. This is a very, very dense plot. I apologize for that. There are a bunch of different systems here. I'm going to show what this shows for GrowMax is that first we scale. We scale really well now. These new code implementations, what I didn't tell you is that you know what we did after we did all that GPU code? We took all the GPU optimizations and brought them back to the CPU. And the cool thing is that after spending 20 years optimizing GPUs, being very happy when we get 1 unit of percent, just taking the GPU code back to standard x86 processors kind of doubled the performance. And that also shows don't become a dinosaur and think your code is fast just because you spent 20 years on it, because, well, we had spent 20 years on it, but in those 20 years, architectures changed. But they changed gradually, and we really hadn't understood how much they had changed in 20 years. So we no longer stop at 250 atoms. Using exactly those algorithms for the GPUs, but applying them on CPUs, we scale roughly 5 times better. So that's awesome. I have an example of that, actually, but I'll show you that in a second. We actually scale pretty well on GPUs, too. On GPUs here, we scale to roughly, down to roughly 1,000 atoms per GPU, which is an order of magnitude better scaling than anybody else has shown for GPUs before. I like that, too. However, what really matters is performance. And what matters is the performance plot you see there, a green star. You might not be able to see this, but this purple dot out here is a very nice code developed by colleagues of ours at the K Computer in Japan called Modulas. This code runs on, it's 10 million atoms running virtually on the entire K computer. And running on the entire K computer, they get roughly 32 nanoseconds per day for 10 million atoms. So the green dot here is a 12 million atom system we're running, but we are running this on 1 island of SuperMUC. So roughly 12,000 processors running our code, we're beating all of the K computer. So that's a roughly 2 orders of magnitude price difference. And that also shows the importance of performance. That had you asked me 10 years ago, I would have been a performance evangelist. I think I've changed my tune there a bit, because it is important to have large codes that are maintainable. It's important to be able to understand things. Parallelism can frequently beat performance. If I can scale 2 orders of magnitude better than you can, it doesn't help that you have 1 order of magnitude better performance than I do. But if you're talking about these investments for billions of dollars and you can do something 2 orders of magnitude more efficiently, this is millions of dollars of usage we're talking about here. And at this stage, this of course matters, because unless you're one of the core groups, there is no way you're going to get access to these resources exclusively for week after week after week. Most of us will have to make do with a very tiny fraction of them. Now, you could argue that, yeah, I'm a geek and I love hacking GPUs. Yes, guilty as charged. I enjoy hacking SIMD code, too, guilty as charged. And you could argue that all those things are just corner cases. Why should we worry about it? Isn't it better to focus on scaling and making sure that codes work well in general, and that they parallelize, and that they're easy to maintain? And the CPU vendors are going to fix the rest for us. Well, as I already alluded to, the problem here is that you've already lost that game. You just don't know it yet. The game is over. Game, set, and match. Everybody, we love showing all these beautiful plots. The Swedish supercomputing centers do it too, and then they just extrapolate up what a large system they're going to have in 3 years, of how many flops they're going to have. You could argue that's true, because they're just going to have more and more and more processors. But that's not how you think as a programmer. What you think as a programmer is that you're going to keep getting higher performance from your codes, and that's not true. You will get higher performance provided that you can keep increasing your scaling exponentially. Because that's like these go as 2 to the power of n. And unless your code will scale exponentially, you will not be able to keep up with this curve if you're counting on increased parallelism. So the problem here is really, as we did the NARD scaling and everything, and the semiconductor price going down exponentially. And the problem is that it's not true anymore. So we had a fun talk about this at this SOS conference, and that's, I'm not an expert in this, but just to get roughly the idea, the problem what's now happening, in particular with the 40 nanometer transition, is that we're not getting a factor 2 every 18 months. We might get a factor 1.75, which is not too bad. The problem is that we're getting that at a massive increase in cost. So I and everybody else, I think we go around pretending that, yeah, there is a path, we might get to 5 nanometer architectures or something. It's not obvious that that's going to happen. Obviously, we're going to go to 40 nanometer because that's like a 16% improvement in bang for the buck or something. Intel is going to do that unless they're completely crazy, in particular since they already invested in the fabs. But the problem is at some point, the point here is not what's technically feasible in a physics laboratory. The problem is what's feasible in the Intel board. When this gets down to 8% or something, they might very well say that screw it, it's not worth it. Technically, we might be able to do 5 nanometers, but it's not worth it. We can't make that money back. It's not enough of a return on investment. And that's not going to happen at 40 nanometer, but we might very well stop at 10 nanometers. And then you can kiss goodbye to the whole idea of getting faster computers, say 24 months from now. It's a very direct, and the one thing that we know is that Intel is going to hit this boundary hard brick wall 2 to 3 years before anybody else. And it's coming much, much, much sooner than you think. And what that means for you is that you don't really have an alternative. It might not call it a GPU. You might want to call it Xeon Phi if you're masochistic. But the point is that you will have to go to accelerators if you want massive amounts of floating point throughput. That's my bet, at least. And the reason for this has to do with the energy consumptions. The CPU is not even in the race here. We are increasingly going to see unified memory architectures so that you have, forget about this as a CPU, as a GPU, rather than, when I started in computing, you had these separate floating point processors, right? Nobody would dream of having the floating point processor in a separate chip anymore. And 5 years from now on, nobody's going to dream of having your latency optimized cores and your throughput optimized cores in separate chips, as we do right now. But all of us will have to learn to program the throughput optimized cores if we want to have any sort of performance to speak about, I guess. So let's see. I think I have 10, 15 more minutes here. So I'm going to try to use it and paint another picture that how we're trying to address this. Because no matter how happy we are with the scaling here, like trying to be proud that we can scale to 10,000 cores or something doesn't quite cut it when the largest machines in the world have 3 million cores. And it's far, far, far worse than that. So this is one of my favorite slides. And it's my favorite slide because I made it like 4 years ago. And that's the reason why I have Jaguar and Eugene on top of it. In 2010, when Eugene was installed, it was the largest computer in the world, 300,000 cores. That was a sexy baby at a point in time, apart from the fact that it was a blue gene. And then we had the largest machine, I don't even remember this anymore, but in 2012, we had roughly 1 million cores, and we actually had that too. So this is just the Dinard scaling. It works. In 2014, this boss would have expected that we should have had 3 million cores. That's not true, actually. It happened already late 2013. And again, just keep extrapolating this. 2016, 10 million cores might happen already next year. 2018, we're going to have 30 million cores. Whether you call these cores or processor elements is completely irrelevant, but it's some sort of computational unit. And the message that I want to drive home here is that just keep extrapolating this, and sometime a little while after 2020, you're going to have 1 billion functional elements in the largest supercomputers in the world. And in that perspective, trying to be proud that you scale to 10,000 cores, like they won't let you within a kilometer radius of the machine if you only scale to 10,000 cores. If you can scale to 1 million cores, you don't even scale to 1%. You scale to 0.1% of the machine. And I would guess today, if you can't even scale to 1% of the machine, you're not even eligible to run right. So that anybody who doesn't scale to 10 million cores won't even be allowed on these machines. And in particular, those of you who are students, I think the key thing to think about here is not how you want to scale and anything, but how are you going to use 1 billion cores? That's going to happen. That's going to happen if you're starting out as a student now. That's going to happen roughly by the time, well, it's going to happen before you have tenure. Unfortunately, I know what's going to happen in MD here. There are going to be a number of groups, I hope I'm not one of them, that use this to increase the size of your system. So rather than simulating a protein, we could simulate an entire cell, or 3, 4, 5 cells. That's going to be a couple of hundreds of billions of atoms. That's going to be enough to scale. The sad thing is that we all know very well what the end result of that simulation is going to be, because the problem is that we can make a simulation that's 1 million times larger, but that does not extend the timescales. And if you look at an entire cell and simulate that for 1 nanosecond, the end result is going to look exactly the same as the starting result. Unfortunately, this will probably make it to the cover of some glossy magazine by 2024, and the group saying that they did exa scaling or yotta scaling or whatever they call it. And this is not a problem we've solved, but we're working a whole lot of this. And the thoughts we're having is that, yeah, I'm cheating, of course. Somewhere here, if you think a billion cores, I'm going to give up. There is no way I will run a simulation, one single simulation over an exascale computing. But we need to start to think much more in terms of ensembles. This is something we've done quite successfully for a number of years in folding at home. But it's not limited to that type of stuff. Most of the things we do in simulation is somehow founded in statistical mechanics. And anything in statistical mechanics, I can usually find a great way to use at least 10 samples, and in many cases, hundreds or thousands of samples. The problem, in particular in folding at home, is that it becomes a maintenance nightmare to keep track of these thousands of simulations, where they're running, if they died, if you filled up the queue system, if you ran out of time somewhere, somebody killed your job because they had a maintenance window and everything. So we are increasingly writing programs to handle this automatically. Think of this as folding at cluster, where we're really having parallelization on a whole range of different levels. So the idea is that we're going to use GPU, SIMD acceleration, multi-threading MPI, and then have each of these chunks, which is a job that then might then use a couple of thousand cores. But then we're going to run hundreds of these workers in every server and possibly even communicate between different supercomputers. And we actually have this working in a couple of cases. This is the villain headpiece, which was the system that Peter Coleman simulated for months in a supercomputing. It's a tiny system. It's roughly 7,000 atoms with water and everything. I'm not showing the water here. And we're running this in a setup that's very similar to folding at home. The problem in folding at home is that we don't have GPUs, we don't have parallelization, but on a supercomputer we do. So we run roughly 50 nanoseconds per generation, and these generations, this was 2 years ago when it took 10 hours, we can probably do this in 5 hours per iteration now. But then we use roughly 6,000 cores for this. We're running like 400 simulations that are independent of each other in parallel. Well, technically, they're not independent. They communicate, but they only communicate, say, once a minute or something, not every microsecond. The cool thing, if you do the math here, is that I have effective scaling to 1.3 atoms per core. Compared to that, to those 40 to 80 atoms that I was really proud of a couple of slides ago. And the cool thing is that this works amazingly well. So this takes roughly 24 hours, and the white one here is the experimental structure. The red one is my simulated one. The cool thing here is that I'm not cheating. Almost everybody doing protein folding is cheating, me included. And people cheat in the way that we know what the white structure is, so we track the red structure, and when the red structure flies by the white structure, I immediately hit the stop button and claim that I could fold the protein. That's not folding. So what we can do with this type of ensemble techniques, I exhaustively sample the phase space. So the red structure here is actually a prediction of us where we have not used any information from the white structure. But I predict that the red structure here should be the lowest free energy of this particular molecule, which is then within 1.5 angstrom of the experimental structure. So we really get a convergence here in, 46 hours was at the time. And doing this type of analysis, not only can we scale really well and use some of the largest resources in the world, we actually managed to beat custom purpose designed application-specific integrated circuit hardware. Because we have, our absolute performance is not better, but we are much, much more cost efficient, and we can have orders of magnitude better throughput because I can use tens of thousands of cores in parallel. This is available if people want to play with it. It's very much work in progress, and we like it for the type of problems we work with. It's an entirely agnostic plugin architecture. It has nothing to do with GROMACS actually. But I very much like this approach of being able to run some things of ensemble simulations of supercomputers, in particular because I really hate keeping track of my runs. Now, before I stop, I'm going to have 1 minute, and this is an important memento mori here. You might think that I'm a geek, I love hacking GPUs and everything. You don't really care about any of these things. You will just keep using your program that either you or your advisor or your advisor's grand advisor wrote 1960, because that's good enough for now, and computers are so fast anyway. But computer developments happen much faster than we think. And these jumps are frequently very, very sudden. So even when I started my PhD in Sweden, Sweden still had a vector computer by Cray. And the memento mori slide I want to show you here, that those of you who are young don't remember these machines. They were really sexy. Cray T90, the last one was shipped in 1999. It was an awesome machine at the time, 50 gigaflops. which is roughly half the performance of my iPhone. The problem is that there are a whole lot of codes that absolutely needed to use these vector machines. And that's the reason why Sweden kept buying them. We have some very large research groups whose code simply could not run on any other architecture, and we kept buying Fujitsu machines for a couple of years until they eventually gave up, basically because Fujitsu was hardly selling them anymore. Nobody else in the country could use it. And at that point, they simply said, tough luck. If your code can't run on the machines we have, that means you're not going to run your code. And that will happen. It's going to happen much, much, much sooner than you think. This might not be GPUs, but I would be extremely surprised if the processors we have 5-10 years from now on are going to be standard x86-like processors where you don't have to worry about accelerators or anything. So if you take that attitude, sit back, lean, you're going to be very comfortable for 5 years. But somewhere around 2020 or something, it's going to strike you that your code will not run at all on the machines that are available then. And you're going to be kind of restricted to the equivalent of what an iPhone is today. And that's going to be pretty hard, I think, to be competitive in high-performance computing under those conditions. And again, there is nothing you can do to solve it. We're not talking about architectural decisions because vendors think it's nice or something. The reason you could hate CUDA. I certainly hate Intel Mike the way it looks right now, but that's not the point. These are fundamental architectural decisions that you need to be extremely parallel if you want to have any chance of high-performance computing. I will stop there, and I would be happy to take some questions. There are lots of people who have helped us here, in particular CSCS. Thomas, our parallelization wouldn't be anywhere near what it is without all the help and access to PIN-Steins. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Eric, thank you very much for the great talk on molecular simulation and GPUs, and I guess we have time for a few questions. So there's one.
I was once talking to Tom Cheatham about how they did it, and if I understood it correctly, they're trying to offload the entire NP engine onto the GPU. Now, you're doing the pair list, or part of it, on the GPU. Considering your comments about the future of computing, where do you think one should go?
That's very hard to say in general. I think obviously, long-term, I believe if you really want to run things in parallel, I think it's going to be virtually impossible. Amber 2 has like millions of lines of code, and Amber has very good performance for a very, very small subset of features, the ones that are coded on the GPU. I think it's not realistic that people will port 2 million lines of code to every new architecture. It's not going to happen. The one thing that might stir up the market a bit is that within the next couple of years, and we're talking about 1 to 2 years here, I don't think you're going to pair the most common pairing with the GPU is not going to be an x86, but an ARM, because that's an architecture that NVIDIA has access to. NVIDIA is barred by Intel from accessing the chipsets and everything. On ARM, on the other hand, NVIDIA could do really cool stuff, embed an ARM chip on their GPU, and pretty much try to sell this as a chip for general purpose computing or something. And then it comes back, it's probably not the best HPC chip, but that's where you have the power of the market and everything. I think those chips are going to be insanely good value for money. But they're going to be a nightmare to program, because then you're going to need to get by with a CPU that's like 1/10 of the performance of current CPUs.
Okay, so there's one more question.
I'm a bit puzzled by these million lines of code, because when I look at your diagram of what you're doing, and I see PME as like, and neighbor lists, and so that can't be more than a few thousand lines of code.
So in many cases, what we are really obsessed with this. We never ever want to calculate a result if I know that I never ever want to calculate an operation if I know that the result of this operation is going to be 0. Because the floating point the fastest floating point operation is the one I can remove from the code. And my normal way of doing this is we have insane amounts of problem-specific code. So for instance, a water molecule, on the classical molecular simulation level, you approximate a water as an oxygen and 2 hydrogens. That's technically true, but it's only the oxygen that has both non-bonded Lennard-Jones interactions and charge. The hydrogens are small, so that you only have charge on them. So if I now have 2 waters interacting, technically it's 9 interactions, but there's only one of those interactions that has a Lennard-Jones interaction. So for 8 of them, I only need to do the charge interaction. So there is routine after routine after routine where I have code that's really special purpose software to try to avoid calculated interactions, and that increases the number of codes a lot. And then there are all these special corner cases if you want to do free energy calculations, you want to pull something, routines that might be used in 1% of the simulation. But on the other hand, there are probably 200-300 routines like that. So in general, you will probably use one of them in any simulation. It's just that there are lots of different ones, so they're hard to remove.
Can I follow up? So there's another thing about this obsession about avoiding floating point operations. We should try to create algorithms that have the lowest possible complexity. I agree with that. We should try to avoid floating point operations. But when it comes to avoiding floating point operations at the expense of moving data on today's machines, we may not win at that point because the floating point units are
No, you're right.
trivial.
And that's actually a major change for us in the new CUDA code, that we actually moved back to the CPUs. So we do far less fancy load balancing in our non-bonded interactions in the new code. Now we simply do a brute force approach to get these nice 4x4 tiles. And that's, of course, and I think that's a great example of what Bill spoke about too. That's one of the reasons why it scaled so much better. But nota bene, it does not scale better because our scalar version is slower. It scales the absolute performance ends up being much better than the scalar version. So the load balancing we got from these horribly imbalanced interaction actually ended up killing our performance. So I think you're right, but it's also, this is a gradual process. We can't afford to, in many of these things, that the algorithms are so optimized that a simple brute force algorithm is not going to beat it. But I think we are increasingly going to stick with simple algorithms.
Okay, so I see one more question. Yes, please use the microphone.
Yes, you said that you will hit the transistor barrier, 40 nanometers or 10 nanometers soon. But if Intel hits this barrier, NVIDIA hits it all also. Then you can reduce the transistor forms to get an additional factor of 10 or 100, and then you are done. After that point, whenever you want to double the overall compute performance, you have to double your investment.
Yes, I think so. NVIDIA is going to have a couple of more years, but yes, that will happen.
In this context, do you really feel that it is interesting to make large ensembles because then you have to pay for each ensemble you are doing? You have to carefully select which ensemble you are doing. Because
yes.
doubling the machine size is doubling the investment.
It's a difficult question, and I think there was a similar discussion when all these digital single-lens reflex cameras started to appearing, right? Because they too use CMOS chips. And all these small cameras were so cheap, and the big challenge with if you want the SLR cameras is that they need a 33mm sensor. And the problem there was you didn't need more transistors, but you needed a physically larger sensor, and then Moore's law doesn't hold, because Moore's law only holds if you can squeeze more things in a smaller area. But apparently, when it comes to these cameras, they are surprisingly cheap. So people managed to produce these sensors not quite as fast as Dinard scaling, but significantly cheaper than what it was a couple of years ago. So I'm still fairly enthusiastic that NVIDIA and other companies that don't rely on cranking up the clock frequency can produce some sort of chip where they manage to squeeze in more and more functional units, even if that means increasing the chip area. But that's an open question. And you're certainly right that it's not going to happen naturally.
Okay, I see one more short question from Petros Koumoutsakos.
I'd like to say one more possible direction in this ensemble that you propose. I think in molecular dynamics, there's many parameters. There's like 20, 30 parameters that hold potential scale. So I think it makes sense to do uncertainty quantification in molecular dynamics and to study spaces of parameters when you're presenting the result. And that could be complementing to what you're proposing, I think, in this.
Yeah. But it's of course also a problem that does not hold for all problems. And I think quantum chemistry is going to have even larger challenges than we do because, again, that doesn't build on statistical mechanics. And I'm very happy that it's not my task to scale quantum chemistry to 1 million cores. That's going to be difficult.
Okay, so thank you very much,
Thank
Eric,
you.
for joining us for coming to this conference.